After Esther was returned to his father, Rahel stayed with her mother, in Imenem. And eventually, after Amu died, the last time she came back to Imenem, crying in the bus, swollen with cortisone, and a rattle in her chest, that sounded like a faraway man shouting. Rahel drifted, from school to school. She spent her holidays in Imenem, largely ignored by Chaco and Mamachi, and largely ignoring baby Kachama. In matters related to the raising of Rahel, Chaco and Mamachi tried, but couldn't. They provided the care, but withdrew the concern. The loss of Sophie Moll stepped softly around the Imenem house, like a quiet thing in socks. It hid in books and food. In Mamachi's violin case. In the scabs of the sores on Chaco's shins, that he constantly worried. In his slack, womanish legs. It is curious how sometimes the memory of death lives on for so much longer than the memory of the life that it purloined. Over the years, as the memory of Sophie Moll slowly faded, the loss of Sophie Moll grew robust and alive. It was always there, like a fruit in season, every season. As permanent as a government job. It ushered Rahel, through childhood, into womanhood. Rahel was first blacklisted in Nazareth Convent, at the age of 11, when she was caught outside her housemistress's garden gate, decorating a knob of fresh cow dung with small flowers. At assembly, the next morning, she was made to look up the word depravity in the Oxford Dictionary and read aloud its meaning. The quality or condition of being depraved or corrupt. Rahel read, with a row of stern-mouthed nuns seated behind her, and a sea of sniggering schoolgirl faces in front. Perverted quality, moral perversion. The innate corruption of human nature, due to original sin. Both the elect and the non-elect come into the world in a state of total and alienation from God, and can of themselves do nothing but sin. 6 months later, she was expelled, after repeated complaints, from senior girls. She was accused of hiding behind doors and deliberately colliding with her seniors. When she was questioned by the principal about her behavior, she eventually admitted that she had done it to find out whether breasts hurt. In that Christian institution, breasts were not acknowledged. They weren't supposed to exist. That was the first of 3 expulsions. The second, for smoking. The third, for setting fire to her housemistress's false hair bun, which, under duress, Rahel confessed to having stolen. In each of the schools she went to, the teachers noted that she was an extremely polite child. Had no friends. It appeared to be a civil, solitary form of corruption. Arid for this very reason, they all agreed. It was, they whispered to each other, as though she didn't know how to be a girl. They weren't far off the mark. Oddly, neglect seemed to have resulted in an accidental release of the spirit. Rahel grew up without a brief. Without anybody to arrange a marriage for her. Without anybody who would pay her a dowry, and therefore, without an obligatory husband looming on her horizon. So as long as she wasn't noisy about it, she remained free to make her own inquiries into breasts and how much they hurt. Into false hair buns and how well they burned. Into life and how it ought to be lived. When she finished school, she won admission into a mediocre college of architecture in Delhi. It wasn't the outcome of any serious interest in architecture. Nor even, in fact, of a superficial one. She just happened to take the entrance exam and happened to get through. The staff were impressed by the enormous size, rather than the skill, of her charcoal, still life sketches. The careless, reckless lines were mistaken for artistic confidence, though in truth, their creator was no artist. She spent 8 years in college without finishing the 5-year undergraduate course and taking her degree. The fees were low, and it wasn't hard to scratch out a living. Staying in the hostel, eating in the subsidized student mess, rarely going to class, working instead as a draftsman in gloomy architectural firms that exploited cheap student labor to render their presentation drawings, and to blame when things went wrong. The other students, particularly the boys, were intimidated by Rahel's waywardness and almost fierce lack of ambition. They left her alone. She was never invited to their nice homes or noisy parties. Even her professors were a little wary of her bizarre, impractical building plans, presented on cheap brown paper. Her indifference to their passionate critiques. She occasionally wrote to Chaco and Mamachi, but never returned to Imenem. Not when Mamachi died. Not when Chaco emigrated to Canada. It was while she was at the College of Architecture that she met Larry McCaslin, who was in Delhi, collecting material for his doctoral thesis on energy efficiency in vernacular architecture. He first noticed Rahel in the school library, and then again, a few days later, in Khan Market. She was in jeans and a white t-shirt. Part of an old, patchwork bedspread was buttoned around her neck and trailed behind her like a cape. Her wild hair was tied back to look straight, though it wasn't. A tiny diamond gleamed in one nostril. She had absurdly beautiful collarbones and a nice athletic run. There goes a jazz tune, Larry McCaslin thought to himself, and followed her into a bookshop where neither of them looked at books. Rahel drifted into marriage like a passenger drifts towards an unoccupied chair in an airport lounge. With a sitting down sense. She returned with him to Boston. When Larry held his wife in his arms, her cheek against his heart, he was tall enough to see the top of her head, the dark tumble of her hair. When he put his finger near the corner of her mouth, he could feel a tiny pulse. He loved its location. And that faint, uncertain jumping, just under her skin. He would touch it, listening with his eyes, like an expectant father, feeling his unborn baby kick inside its mother's womb. He held her as though she was a gift given to him in love. Something still and small, unbearably precious. But when they made love, he was offended by her eyes. They behaved as though they belonged to someone else. Someone watching. Looking out of the window at the sea. At a boat in the river, or a passerby in the mist in a hat. He was exasperated because he didn't know what that look meant. He put it somewhere between indifference and despair. He didn't know that in some places, like the country that Rahel came from, various kinds of despair competed for primacy. And that personal despair could never be desperate enough. That something happened when personal turmoil dropped by at the wayside shrine of the vast, violent, circling, driving, ridiculous, insane, unfeasible, public turmoil of a nation. That big God howled like a hot wind and demanded obeisance. Then small God came away cauterized, laughing numbly at his own temerity. Inured by the confirmation of his own inconsequence, he became resilient and truly indifferent. Nothing mattered much, nothing much mattered. And the less it mattered, the less it mattered. It was never important enough. Because worse things had happened. In the country that she came from, poised forever, between the terror of war and the horror of peace. Worse things kept happening. So small God laughed, a hollow laugh, and skipped away cheerfully. Like a rich boy in shorts. He whistled, kicked stones. The source of his brittle elation was the relative smallness of his misfortune. He climbed into people's eyes and became an exasperating expression. What Larry McCaslin saw in Rahel's eyes was not despair at all, but a sort of enforced optimism. And a hollow where Esther's words had been. He couldn't be expected to understand that. That the emptiness in one twin was only a version of the quietness in the other. That the two things fitted together. Like stacked spoons. Like familiar lovers' bodies. After they were divorced, Rahel worked for a few months as a waitress in an Indian restaurant in New York. And then, for several years, as a night clerk in a bulletproof cabin at a gas station, outside Washington, where drunks occasionally vomited into the till, and pimps propositioned her with more lucrative job offers. Twice she saw men being shot through their car windows. And once a man who had been stabbed ejected from a moving car with a knife in his back. Then, baby Kachama wrote to say that Esther had been re-returned. Rahel gave up her job at the gas station and left America gladly to return to Imenem. To Esther, in the rain,